What time is it? Can you hear me? All right, good afternoon, ladies and gents. Might as well make a start now. My name's Tariq Malik. I'm the Compliance and QA Manager at the ASFP. So I started back in October last year. So I was brought on to look after all things certification related to the ASFP. So I come from a certification background, so I've actually worked in a certification body before in the testing lab. So as part of my remit, I was brought on board to then sort of get the ASFP up to speed on things. So this presentation is intended to cover what role certification plays in passive fire protection. Hopefully it will be informative and give you some idea of voluntary third-party certification, what it's about, as well as the mandatory certification that also exists as well. So I want to start off with a couple of definitions because there's always a bit of confusion about this, because you find that a lot of people confuse accreditation with certification, and it is used interchangeably. These are the definitions. So the accreditation definition there is actually from the International Accreditation Forum, so that's exactly as what it is. So accreditation is actually the highest tier level that you get. Usually accreditation is, well, not usually, it's always issued by a government level body. They look at so there'll be a semi-government organisation. In the case of, say, the UK, that's the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, or UCAS. So they grant certification bodies, testing labs, the scope to actually provide testing services as well as certification services. And it is quite an onerous process. So what they do is they actually vet these organisations, make sure that they've got the capabilities, they've got the staff, the competence, and they've got the right sort of like training in place. Certification is actually the next stage down. So certification, in this case third-party certification or attestation, is issued by the certification bodies who are accredited. So these certification bodies go out and check manufacturers, installers, etc., to make sure that they offer their services or the installation of their products in line with a scope, a certification scheme. So these schemes are written in such a way that it looks at product standards, competency requirements, as well as some other bits and pieces that the certification bodies put in there. Now I will cover what sort of certification involves as well in the next stages. Right. Now, to start off with, so with CPR, the Construction Products Regulation, so there are two methods of complying for products in certain categories. So what you see is a nice tick box there, what the specific requirements are. So the approved body is effectively, that tends to be the mandatory type products that need to be certified in legal terms. It says that these products fall under that scope. So you need to have an approved body come in and do those product assessments, if you will. They then do the ongoing factory production control checks, etc. And as you can see, it's quite onerous. Now they do come in 5 levels. I know it doesn't quite make sense. It says 1 plus 1, 2 plus. You'd think it goes 1 to 5, but that's the way it is. The manufacturer requirements, you can see just at the bottom there, so they have specific requirements as well. The manufacturers tend to get involved in more the 3-4 type AOC levels, so effectively they will get involved with, in terms of the factory production control, naturally, because they're the ones that are manufacturing it. But of course, sometimes there's also a requirement for them to do the initial type testing as well as the sampling, etc. So these are some of the typical products that you might find that fall into the category of the AOC level. So you can see on the left-hand side we've got the AOC level and typical product categories that they fall under. So the 1 plus is actually the most onerous. So in that respect, what you have to then do is, as well as the initial sampling, the type testing, They have to do the ongoing surveillance bits as well. There's factory production control checks, etc. And there's some audit testing where they actually take products back and recheck them as well. The other categories, of course, like going back to previous slides, obviously they're not as onerous, so some of them don't require the ongoing checks. Now, this table actually I've taken from the recent morale report. That was came out last week, I believe. My colleague Andy kindly forwarded it to me. So there's actually, it's a good scope, and they've done some scoping exercise in terms of what typical products fall under CPR. This is just a snapshot looking at passive fire related products. There is more in there. They've got like timber structures and like the fasteners, etc. that go with those as well. It's in that particular table. But if you are interested, it's in that particular report. Now, one thing I've got to make a note on though is when it comes to the 1+ level sort of attestation conformity, which is your required approved body. The way they tend to do things, of course, there's usually a harmonised European standard or HEN standard that scopes out the product categories. So a particular product in construction will fall into that standard, and the assessment for that product is done to that standard. And then, of course, the following bit is that they do factory production control checks afterwards, assuming that the products comply. Now, of course, that does pose the area. There are some grey areas. There's not always a product standard for every single product out there. So, of course, these are the bits that that they can cause a few issues. But of course, it's where the approved bodies then work with the manufacturer will work on that. But the beauty behind third-party certification, of course, is that third-party certification schemes can do a mixture. There's not a requirement that you have to do it to a harmonised, recognised standard. You can take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put it into a scheme document and sort of do a compliant certification scheme. So, this is just a quick snapshot. It's an old report. I know we all know the Hackett report. So this is actually a recommendation taken from the Hackett report, saying what their role as third-party certification is, or the importance of they see into that. Of course, this is now it's quite an old document now. So of course, recently we've got the morale report that's just come out. There is a recommendation from that. It's just a statement. The recommendations on there. There is no exact recommendation in this particular report that says that you have to do third-party certification. But what it does is it recognises the importance that third-party certification can play in the in product sort of categories and making sure that people are compliant, especially where there's like grey areas. My colleague Andy obviously cover the report in a little bit more detail, what this involves. But the recommendation, of course, that they've come up with in terms of third-party certification is that the recommendation is that they'll set up a group that will then talk to these certification bodies, manufacturers, etc., and come up with some best guidance and practice on best practice to comply with what the certification scheme should involve for a lot of the CPR products that don't fall into the 1+ category. So, the next stage question is, what does certification involve? Now, first thing first, I need to point out that like testing to harmonised standards or designated standards, certification is voluntary. Third-party certification is voluntary. Sorry, I should clarify that. There is no requirement that you must have your product certified, but of course there are merits of third-party certification. Now, one of the things that third-party certification has is that it's an independent review. So it's not the manufacturer that's done it. It's a recognised body, typically UCAS accredited body. They'll come in, they'll do the independent review of the product, test the product, and then they'll check the systems, etc., and then give they'll give a recommendation for certification, and they'll take it from there. One of the things that for a certification body, there is requirements. They have to be that fall under 17065. This is the accreditation standard for certification bodies. So there are requirements in that document. So there it says that anyone doing the assessment has to be competent. The testing lab that does the testing needs to know what they're doing. They have to have the right equipment. There's also requirements for certification bodies to have the adequate insurance. So if something goes wrong out in there, there is a shared liability implication there, so of course they have to make sure that they get adequate cover on that. And it's also there's a requirement for them to have ongoing financial stability as well. You'd be surprised, 1706 is quite stringent on what they how these bodies should operate. But in terms of what certification involved, this is typically what you're looking at. This is like a Type 5 scheme. So I'll cover schemes or the levels of certification in a minute. But what it typically involves is product selection. Now, the product selection also involves family members. So, as we alluded earlier at the PFKG meeting, you can't test every combination of product. So what they will try and do is they'll try and best group products as they can, and what they call a family group them. So they'll decide on what there is. First things first, manufacturer come down and say, well, this is what I want to have certified. Certification body or the technical experts will then liaise with manufacturers and say, okay, based on our assessment, these are the groups of products that we think we should have assessed, which could then cover your whole range. They'll then select the products, and typically they might even go on site and just say we want those particular samples. They'll request the samples of those products to then be tested. So those products after selection will then go to a test laboratory. That the scope of what's tested is usually written in the certification scheme. So it could be BS 476, it might be the other EN standards. They'll specify whatever the product standard they need to have compliant. As I mentioned before, if it's like a brand new, unique product that doesn't have a specific standard, they can then make a decision to say that we're going to take these clauses out this safety standard, these clauses out these safety standards, do a mix of it, and in the absence of a standard that covers the product outright, this is our best way of assessing it, and then a test lab will then go ahead and test it. After the testing process is completed, usually you can actually run those parallels. So a lot of the certification bodies do try and do that to speed things up. A factory audit's then organised. Now, factory audit, exactly that. They go around the facilities, making sure that the products are manufactured as was delivered to the testing lab. So they will check the floor, they'll check components, they'll check manufacturing techniques, they'll check the competence of staff, they'll check that the measuring equipment, etc., that the manufacturers use are all compliant. And then after that, what then happens is that a report then goes back to the certification body. So effectively you get two bits. You get one from the testing lab, say, yes, this product does comply with the standard, and these are the criteria. And then the factory audit, the auditor then give their recommendation, say, based on our factory audit on there, we're quite comfortable that they're covered, all the requirements of the scheme. And it then goes to an independent person in the certification body to then make a decision that am I happy to sign off on this, and then what they'll do is they'll have a certification decision. After the certification decision is done, that's usually that's it. Effectively, you've got your certificate, and then of course with a lot of the Type 5 schemes which I cover, they can do product marking as well, so they can start applying the badge, if you will. Now, one of the things that you do have to have with more onerous schemes is that there's ongoing factory inspection, and that's the beauty behind third-party certification, that it's not just a one-off, you do the initial bit and then that's it, it's all done. No, what you do is they do go back to the factory and then check, are they still manufacturing it in line with the process that we initially signed them up on, or if they've changed the techniques, has it affected the products? If it's affected the products, then they might have to do a technical evaluation, reevaluate and retest it again to check that a product is still compliant. So it is circular. And then, of course, on top of the factory production control, what you also find is that they'll do verification testing. So they'll go into the factory and they'll say, I want that particular unit at the bottom of the stack there, fish it out for me and send it back to the test lab, or pick something off the factory floor, or even in stores. So they'll then pick that up and then goes back to the testing lab, and they'll then redo some verification tests. Now, verification tests aren't the full test that you get right at the beginning. At the product testing stage, it might be limited testing on there, but of course it's just checking that nothing's changed. And of course, it's a nice circular thing, ergo the circle that you've got on there. So it's very circular. Right. So the question is all certification the same? And the answer to that is no. So 17067, I've written out standards to you. That's the standard for writing certification schemes. There's a lot of standards we work with, like 1700, 1706. Yes. So this particular standard, what it says on there, it gives some guidance for certification bodies to write certification schemes. As I mentioned before, when you certify a product, you certify it against a certification scheme. So these are basically written by the certification bodies themselves. And what it does in that, there's a nice table in there that says there's different types of certification schemes. So there's like a 1A, 1B, etc., which I'll cover in a bit. And what they do is each of those have ongoing and more onerous requirements. So as you go up the certification levels, there's more and more that you have to do. So typically your type 5 ones that you might see a lot, the pacifier stuff that we have see third-party certification tends to be the type 5 one. Type 5 has exactly what we saw on the previous slide on there. It has the ongoing checks as well as the initial assessments, etc. And as mentioned, these schemes are written by the certification bodies. Now, the beauty behind it is that the certification bodies also have a requirement that if they write a certification scheme, it's got to be something that's useful for industry. So it's not a case of we think that this is the best approach that we need to do. They actually have to liaise with the manufacturers and check that. Do you think this is achievable? Do you think it's too onerous? Is it not onerous enough? And then checking with them, they'll then write a appropriate certification scheme that industry will take on. Now, there is a requirement that if a scheme doesn't work, the accreditation body UCAS will tell them that if you haven't got customers on this scheme, you're going to have to drop the scheme and come up with something else. So it's one of those things that the certification bodies do have to work with industry to make sure that they write schemes and processes that will actually help the industry, not just sort of it's best practice for them and they get the banknotes in. So it's making sure that it's useful. The last point I put on there is that note out that when I mentioned that UCAS accredit certification bodies to 17065, which is the certification bodies, the product certification standard, what they can do is you can actually have schemes as also UCAS accredited. That means that as well as the certification body checking that the products are compliant, you've got a semi-government organisation coming to check that the certification bodies are compliant with the requirements that they've set out. So you can see it's a check of a check. So they have sort of these sets up. So of course what you can do is that some members might specify that actually we would like to, if we're going to comply with the certification scheme, we'd like to see it UCAS accredited. UCAS accredited is it's a lot of work for the certification body, so they actually have to go through the checks and balances, make sure that they demonstrate competence, etc. So, and there's obviously annual checks on them as well. So you can see it's a nice circular sort of way of doing things. Mentioned before, I hope you can see the slide on there. So you've got the type of certification at the top, and then you've got what's required. Now, with all the schemes, selection is always required. You have to have you have to select a product for testing, and then the determination of characteristics, that's essentially your testing. So what they will then do is just check that the products comply to the requirements of the standard. Now, the requirements of the certification scheme and standards that are associated in that. So what they'll then do is just, the scheme, like I said, can say a few bits and pieces here. They might have their own different requirements, or it might say test to this particular standard. They'll make sure the testing lab will then do that. There's always a decision on certification that has to be an independent decision, so there's always that element of it. One of the big things the struggles that when I was looking after our certification body previous to this, was that because you have to have the separate stages, the people making the certification decision can't get involved in the assessment. People doing the assessment can't get involved in certification, so it's almost like there's a Chinese wall there that you have to sort of do that. And also the whole point of these having this separation out is that should anything go wrong or the manufacturer sort of not quite, you go back with them as a recommendation, yes, you've got certification, they're usually happy, but if you go back and say that your product isn't going to comply, then they have a route to go back and actually query it, or to have a discussion with them to say that we don't think this is the right way of doing things, or you've made the right decision, so you can have that conversation. It's almost like an independent way of dealing with complaints as well. So there's always these barriers in place. Now, as you can see, the surveillance testing and the ongoing checks on it's more like the Type 5 schemes on there. So you can see Type 5, and it's got a lot of the ticks, pretty much all the ticks down there. So that's why you find that a lot of the passive fire certification, third-party certification schemes, they tend to be a Type 5 scheme purely because they're more onerous. So as well as doing the initial bit, there's always the ongoing checks. So post-certification, what's useful? So how does it help contractors, specifiers? Where does third-party certification sit with them? Well, as you can see on there, it's start look for the mark. If it's a Type 5 scheme or the ongoing check, the ones with the factory surveillance, there's usually they allow the manufacturer to apply the certification marker logo on their products. So that's a great way of starting off. If you're not sure, check the product. Has it got a certification mark on it? If it's got a certification mark on it, then that's a good start. What you then want to do is, of course, if they have been granted a certification mark, there's usually a certification certificate. Now, the certificate itself will then detail what products are covered, what product families are covered, and also the scope of certification. Now, that's the big thing that we're talking about in the industry is scope. Now, if you have a passive fire product which is limited to 30 minutes, it's 30 minutes. If it's limited to 60 minutes, 120 minutes, etc., all of that will be given in the detail in the certificate. So that's one way of manufacturer specifiers to check. So as well as looking for the mark, they then ask them, well, can you give me the certificate? Because the certificate will have the technical details of what's covered up to what level. And that's really important, as you can tell, because of course if you pick the wrong product for the wrong situation, then it's not great. But all of that, there is a requirement for certification bodies to give all of that detail, so that whoever the end user is, they've got the knowledge that they can go back and say, is this the right product for them that they can use? The one thing to also note is as with any third-party certification, this is a requirement from the certifications from 17065, is that certification bodies should provide a fee-free free access website that you can then check to see if the certificate's valid. I know some certification bodies require you to log in, but they shouldn't charge you money for this. So that's what it is. So you can hop in, you can check that. So a lot of the details that are on the certificate are also on the website. Now, the reason why the website's really important is because manufacturers might produce a product, they've been given a certificate, I don't know, maybe it was issued last year, and something's gone wrong with production. That's been picked up by the certification body, and what they'll then do is they'll ask him to say that you need to rectify this. If you don't rectify it, we're going to have to pull your certificate. If they pull the certificate, they can't usually ask them. They'll put a request to remove any certificates they're holding and stop marking the products. But of course, there's usually a lag between that. So the best way of checking whether a product is compliant and is still valid is to go onto the certification body's website and then do the check that way. And like I said on there, the certificate will have the certificate number on it. Just in case of copying that, plunk it in there. Is it still there? It's still there. Then that gives you that confidence to say that this product's still compliant. The last thing on there to mention on there is the requirement for certification bodies to step in if something goes wrong. So one of the things that the concerns industry out there is that, yeah, you assess a product, it gets approved, it gets put out into the marketplace. When something goes wrong, who deals with it? And that's always a bit of a grey area. As you can imagine, it's, well, where does the liability sit? Who needs to pick that up? Because a certification body have certified the product, actually there is an onus on them to actually step in and make sure that the manufacturer either rectifies the issue or they'll pull a certificate, and they should go as far as telling them to remove the mark. And of course, that means that because they're involved in that, if there's ever an issue from as a specifier or a contractor that you've requested these products, you can always go back to the certification body if the manufacturer isn't helping out. So what you then do is, if you contact the certification body, they'll just step in and then they'll deal with that for you. Right. So that's sort of like essentially what third-party certification covers and why it's, we feel it's important. Now, the ASFP position on third-party certification is that if there's no mandatory requirement for it, our preference always is that it should be third-party certified, purely because you've got that independent stance on it, and then you check that, making sure that the manufacturers are playing ball. So where does that leave us with the ASFP? So what we're working on is that we recognise that one of the big things that we keep getting told is that, especially with some of the certification schemes that involve installation, for example, PFP installation, is that, well, how do you check that the people who are checking are competent, and how do you check that when things move on, they're still up to speed? And this is the whole big thing about the competency framework and how the industry needs to deal with that one. So what we're looking to do, actually, from the ASFP position, is that we are actually working on a competency framework. Now, Kate Milfords will be doing a talk on our competency framework a little bit later on. It's not today, I believe it's tomorrow. And what she'll then do, she'll explain exactly what the framework involves. But what we want to do from the ASFP position is that we want to work with the certification bodies, to those in particular starting off with installation certification, is to say, well, when it comes to your ongoing checks, when you check a company, that's fine, but how do you prove that the staff are continuously making sure that they're kept up to speed? And that's where our framework will hopefully fit in, and what we will be working with the certification bodies on, that exactly that, is to get them to use our framework as part of the competency checks, and making sure that they then show the continuous development side of things. And then, of course, with that, what they can then do, hopefully will allow them to use as our mark as well, from especially the installation side of things. So we're not in a position to replace UCAS, so we don't want to go in and tell the certification bodies what to do, but what we want to do is work with them to make sure that where the grey areas are on some of their certification schemes, we kind of close the gap. So that's our next journey, and then following on from that, hopefully what we want to then do is actually move on and we'll start looking at products. So at the moment, the big conversation is competence, and of course that's our next stage. So hopefully that covers it, gives you an understanding of what's involved. I guess the next thing is there any questions? I realise it's post-lunchtime, or people are a bit tired.
My question is there a list of the companies and what type of certification they've got, the level, so the 1 to 5 or the 1 to 6?
That's a good question. So when you say companies, you're talking about the certified companies or the actual certification bodies offering the services? Certified companies. See, that's a tricky one. That's where the certification body websites come into their own. If they tell you that they're approved by a particular certification body, what they're approved to should be on that certification body's website. So first question you can ask is to say, what is your product certified and who by? And as soon as I tell you who by, you can just hop on their website, type in, and actually they do filter by company. A lot of them do filter by company name as well, because some of the bigger players will have more than one product certified, so they give you a whole list of these things. Some of them have like thousands of these product types on there, but effectively that's the way to do it. So if you're not sure, first things first is to ask, are you third party certified, and then of course who are you certified by. Any other questions?
Hi, the competency framework that they're talking about, the ASFP, where is that up to at the moment? Is there a scheme actually running?
That's a good question on that. So we are we're a long way away. Well, I say a long way. We're a long way along the process, not away. We are working on. I know Kate and David have. We've brought in some external consultants to help us with this. These guys know their stuff, and they've been working with industry and some of the working groups to make sure that we get the right stuff and we want to hit the. So we are almost at a position that actually we can start. We've picked a few of the roles. And we're going to start pushing these out to say that this is what we're coming up with the framework, and then we're going to start asking the industry to say, what do you think? We're almost at the stage. Our website as well. We're developing our website as well to. We've got the website developer working on it. In the next couple of weeks, hopefully, they'll have the framework set up as well, where you can actually, as a member of the public, can go in and just say, I don't know, installation of fire, collars or baton mastic, what we think the competency should be. It will break it down for you. That's what we're going to start off with, and then of course afterwards, then we'll then work out from when it comes to specifier stage to on-site checking stage. These are the bits that will then bolt on. So it's quite a wide framework, but we have to start somewhere. So we're sort of like starting in the middle, and then we're going to we'll go either way. But Kate is going to cover that, so she'll cover in a lot more detail where we are with these things and the conversations she's had.
Steady. I was going to say, from where we are with that one, we initially identified that there's about 110 different activities, I think is the correct title that we're using, starting from sales and marketing activity all the way through design, procure, install, maintain, and inspect, across different sections, different market sectors. We concentrated initially on installation of fire stopping because Build UK asked us to do that, and we've had a working group bringing in people from outside, and we're using that as our pilot. And then once we've done that with the pilot, I mean, there's 107, I think, of these damn things to do, and so we've done one with a big round group. What we're probably going to try and do is take the learnings from doing that and use that to fill the others and circulate them on a smaller, more narrow field. We've moved from that now. We've tried to do some of the groundwork and some of the foundations on specific design and specification and sales and marketing as like the next step.
Yeah, it's been a challenge to put a lot of work in.
It's a lot of work to do. Yeah. It's an awful lot.
Any other questions?
Are you working along with CCPI and FIS also, because they are working on some other competency as well? And are you guys, how does this sits in line with all the work the other bodies are doing as well as, or are you doing your own set of competency framework and stuff like that, or how does it works?
I'll take that one. So, are we working with CCPI? Yes, we're talking to CCPI. CCPI is about construction product information. I don't know whether they're here tomorrow presenting or not. I think, but we are talking to CCPI about their offer and how what we do and what they do. It's subtly different. They're looking at the product. What we would say to them is that products having third-party certification use that data to underpin your CCPI activities, and that data is the easiest thing to do that. BSI are here tomorrow. We're talking to them about so that we've got third-party certification, BSI identify to hold that information and make that available, CCPI to make sure that companies are then using that responsibly. So there's a logical train, but that's still got third-party certification at the top of it. In terms of the competence thing, what we're doing is we're doing our stuff. We're doing the stuff on the fire stopping. That's pan-industry. It's got people from across the thing. I think there is a guy from FIS sits on our committee, but I'm representatives of manufacturers and installers, and of course we're involved in PFKG, so we're talking to them to make sure that they're adopting. So it's dragging the whole thing together. One of the things we're trying not to do is produce something that's standalone that doesn't help. It helps if it's all pulling in the same direction, but at the same time there's lots of people trying to do stuff that on their own that is trying to monetize this, which is a pain in the neck, and there are certain times where we're just going to have to say sorry. Okay.
There's no more questions, so I guess have a great afternoon. Thanks for attending, and yes, hang on, let me escape out of that. You can get CBD points on there if you do want to get them, so just scan the QR code, register your details, and we'll send you out the cert for that as well. But yeah, thank you very much everybody, and have a great afternoon.